Hey guys, welcome to the channel. It's Jack with Stronghold Strength and Conditioning. And today we're going to be answering the question, should I really be cutting carbohydrates? But before we get into it, make sure you take a moment and hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss out on future content like this. Every Thursday, I'm putting out videos showing you how to resolve aches and pains, prevent injuries, and overall optimize your performance inside the gym and outside of it in your daily life and routine. And it doesn't get much better than that. So take advantage of it. Ready? Let's go ahead and dive into this one. All right, guys, the topic of the day, should I be cutting carbohydrates from my diet altogether or even minimizing them in my diet at all? So the very first question we really need to be asking here is, if we're going to be cutting carbohydrates, and if our ultimate goal is the lean physique and a healthy body, does that include a highly functioning metabolism? Okay, we have to go deeper than just the aesthetics, okay? It's not just about looks, and we need to be asking, does what I'm eating produce the best result metabolically for my long-term health as well? Okay, it's one thing to eat to produce a physique. Trust me, I've done this before myself. It's a whole nother thing to eat in a way that produces health, and that includes body temperature, that includes the pulse that you have, okay, the rate of your pulse. It includes the digestive system in that. It includes your ability to heal. This includes your skin, hair, nails, the health of those. So it is an all-encompassing thing that we really need to be looking at. How much or how often you get sick. There is a number of factors that are affected when our metabolism is slow or our thyroid is running slow because we're not eating in a way that supports us pro-metabolically here. And that is what we're going to be truly looking at today when we answer the question, should I be eating carbohydrates or should I not? Okay, so stick along with me here. We're going to dive right into it. Ready? Let's go. All right, guys, so the very first question that we're going to be asking ourselves today and answering is, what are carbohydrates in the first place? So they are essentially our main source of energy when it comes to feeding our cells, okay? So carbohydrates are first of all made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and they provide us 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate that we eat. All right, so that is similar to protein in that sense. There are both simple and complex carbohydrates. When we look at the simple carbohydrates, those are monosaccharides and disaccharides, okay? And that's just a simple way, or a more complex way of saying carbohydrates there. With the monosaccharides, these are glucose, galactose, and fructose. So that means that it is just the most simple form that it could be. There is no combination of anything. Glucose, galactose, and fructose. 2 of those should sound very familiar because glucose is what we measure when we're measuring our blood sugar. Fructose is commonly found in fruit, and we're going to get deeper into fructose a little bit here as well in a moment. Now, when we get into disaccharides, these are 2 monosaccharides combined together. So sucrose, lactose, maltose. These are sugar, honey, fruits, root vegetables, and milk, essentially. Those are the sugars found in, or those disaccharides are found in those foods right there, and they are 2 monosaccharides actually combined. Now, when we get into complex carbohydrates, these are polysaccharides, so many of these mono put together. Essentially, with these, they are starches and non-starches overall. So there's 2 different types within that. This could be wheat, corn, rice, legumes, beans, lentils, and yes, potatoes and bananas are also incorporated in that, but we will talk a little bit more of on the potatoes and bananas as far as why those are a little bit more acceptable and when you should eat them a little bit more. Starches essentially are long chains of glucose. Okay, so that is essentially what a starch is. And the non-starches are glycogen, and cellulose, which cellulose, know that that is indigestible fiber. Anytime you eat cellulose, it is going to come back out in its regular form and untouched by your body. So this is incorporated in most above ground vegetables, okay? So we have glycogen and cellulose. So this would be spinach, lettuce, any grasses, any seaweed, kale, celery. Those are all non-starchy forms of polysaccharides in that case. At the end of the day, okay, all except cellulose, okay, are able to be broken down by our bodies, although glucose is the preferred source that we have in our body. And we'll talk about why it's actually the preferred source in a moment here. But know that every single one of those is able to be broken down by our bodies except for cellulose. All right, but before we move on, let's talk about fats and proteins and how our body uses those metabolically a little bit. So first of all, why do fats and proteins tend to be what people are leaning toward when they are trying to lose weight? Well, the reason being is because they are more efficient forms of energy. And well, you might be thinking, well, efficient, that must be good, right? Not in terms of our metabolism. We actually want a very inefficient metabolism, meaning that it requires lots of fuel to be burning regularly. If it is using inefficient fuel sources, it has to use more of them, okay, which is good if you're eating the right types of carbohydrates versus fats and proteins here, okay? And we're going to go deeper into this even a little bit more. So first of all, when you eat fats and proteins as your main fuel source, cutting out carbohydrates, this actually promotes a lower metabolism, which is why eventually, if you've been on keto a long time, or if you've been just in general following a low carbohydrate plan, that you find yourself having to cut more calories to continue the weight loss that you were seeing, okay? You've made your body more efficient, meaning that it burns less calories, okay? In order to meet the needs of weight loss, we have to continue to cut in that case, and that is where there's problems overall. So when we use glucose as a main energy source, okay, using carbohydrates, so you can tell my answer is going to be we need carbohydrates here. When we use glucose, it is a wasteful energy source. It produces a higher metabolism, and the byproducts are heat and CO2. When you think of something that is alive, you should think warm and produces a byproduct like CO2, especially when it comes from an animal source like that. So the mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of our cells, actually produce less free radicals in this case, and there is less oxidative damage when we use glucose as our main fuel source. When we use fat and protein as a main fuel source, it is producing more free radicals. It is producing more oxidative damage. And this is one of the biggest reasons right here that we want to make sure that we are incorporating a good balance in our diets and that we are relying on the right forms of carbohydrates to actually fuel that metabolism. So cellular efficiency is basically reliant upon the glucose that we're using. It creates a more cellular efficient metabolism basically overall. So when we store fat, this is energy that's stored and not wasted as heat essentially. And if we are in excess caloric intake, that's when we see fat storage actually, or if we're eating foods that spike our insulin, which we're going to talk about more a little bit here as well. So when we eat fats and proteins, this actually requires our body to also break down more of its own resources. So it takes more from our body to actually break those things down and produce them into glucose so that we can use them. So we're actually transferring these fat and proteins into glucose eventually, but it's more steps to get there, and it is a harder process on our bodies overall. We produce less ATP and less CO2, and again, remember, we want to produce heat, which ATP is an energy source, right, for our bodies, short duration energy source, and CO2 is the byproduct of that metabolism. So if we're producing less of it, there is a slower metabolism and metabolic rate overall. If you think of a living creature again, CO2 and heat, okay? So ATP, energy, and CO2 actually is an antioxidant in our body as well. So we do want CO2 production, and we put it off. Naturally, if you think of the cycle between our expiration of CO2 and plants, that's what they need. So there's probably something to our design here that actually promotes we need to be putting off CO2, and the plants will be taking that up, and they help us in return. So there is that cyclical relationship we have to think about as well outside of our own bodies here. When we use protein as a main fuel source, we're also producing a lot of byproducts, especially ammonia, okay, and tryptophan if we have a high, especially meat type diet when it comes to proteins. So if we're eating a lot of meat, we can be loading our bodies with tryptophan, which is an inflammatory amino acid. There are other ones in there too that we could bring up, but tryptophan is probably the most notable on that. So those are things that can be problematic there with eating a higher fat and protein diet. One thing to note also is that fat is meant to be used as our primary fuel source when we are at rest, okay? Which brings up the argument that we should be building more muscle mass to burn more fat when we're at rest. But when we push it and we're using fat as a fuel source during exercise, this becomes harder on our bodies and again produces more sludge in the form of free radicals and the oxidative damage in our bodies when we force our body to use that as a fuel source for exercise. Next, let's go into a little bit of why the right carbs and not just carbs in general, okay? So first of all, our preferred fuel source of all cells and mainly for the brain is glucose again. So we do need glucose as an energy source, and our brain can actually use up to half of our consumed and stored glucose depending on how hard we're actually thinking, our brain alone. Think about that. So the harder we're concentrating and focusing, it can actually draw from our glucose in the bloodstream and stored and can use up to half of it. That's pretty incredible to think about. And this could be why, when you cut carbs, it is when you cut carbs why you might feel lightheaded, or you might feel scattered, or you might feel forgetful in general. Those are all symptoms of a brain fog that your body is not producing or providing enough glucose to the brain, and it is struggling to get the energy that it needs. It's important to note that. Now, there are certain cells in our bodies like red blood cells and the cells of our retina which can only use glucose as the energy source. So there are no mitochondria in those cells and they have to use glucose as their fuel source. That's as simple as that. It is a quick energy source for muscle specifically. So when we're exercising, when you're doing strength training, whether that be some form of power development or just any type of weight training in general, glucose is our main storage. We're using glycogen from our liver, we're using glycogen from our muscles to produce glucose. The glucose in our bloodstream overall is what we're burning to produce energy for those events. So glycogen is used when we're doing weight training and sprinting. If we don't have enough stored, okay, our muscles, our tissues, and our organs, and even fat while under stress will be broken down. So that's important to note as well. If we don't have enough stored glycogen, our body is going to start to break down tissues. But the important note there is that it's not only breaking down fat, okay? It's breaking down muscle, it's breaking down organs and other tissues. This could be why you take longer to heal, because your body is breaking down itself to produce energy when you don't provide it enough glucose or have enough stored glycogen in that sense. And again, remember that burning fat is meant to be done while we're at rest. That is an energy source when we're at rest, and when we're working, if we're using fat, that also produces more oxidative damage and stress on our bodies overall. So a big reason why we want right carbs right there. Okay, for the metabolism, our liver needs glucose to convert T4 to T3. Okay, so if we don't have enough glucose and our liver has trouble converting T4 to T3, and T3 is the active form of our thyroid hormone. And if you've listened to a couple talks ago, I'll link it up here for you guys, talking about what it looks like to have a healthy metabolism. We go over how our thyroid is directly linked to the metabolism that we have. So that's important to understand, that if our thyroid is suffering, our metabolism is suffering. Okay, T3 is needed by all cells to create ATP. Okay, and we have, you know, things that you might start to see is low body temperature or decreased function of all your systems overall if you're not providing enough glucose. And that would be the digestive, the body temperature, all those things I listed prior. It also needs, our liver also needs glucose for detoxification. It uses glucose for, I think it's over about 500 different processes, or the liver itself has 500 different processes that it needs glycogen stores and glucose to actually perform. One of these could be sleep. So if your sleep is affected, it could be because you're not eating enough of the right types of carbohydrate in your diet. So these are all reasons we need to be consuming some form of carbohydrates in the right forms, okay? Not just any, in our diet that will be beneficial to our overall health, not just our body composition, because you can have both. You can have a good body composition, you can eat carbohydrates, it's just got to be the right kinds. So now let's answer the question, which are the right carbohydrates? Which are best? And if you haven't figured it out, the simple carbohydrates, basically our sugars, our mono and disaccharides, are going to be the best sources of carbohydrates that you want to take in. That's the good news, right? Finally, someone tells you that sugar is good for you. Okay, so what I'm not saying is go down tablespoons of sugar at this point in time, but basically natural organic foods that contain fructose, glucose, lactose, and sucrose. Those are the ones that we want to be putting in our body. This would be most organic fruits, root vegetables, dairy, pulp-free juices, honey, and sugar. Okay, it does not include high fructose corn syrup, agave, sodas, cookies, cakes, candies, crackers, sports and energy drinks, frozen desserts, any of those. Okay, so any of that processed stuff, I hate to say, it's not included in that. It is natural, organic forms of simple sugars. Those are the types of carbohydrates that you should be eating and consuming in your diet. We do not want to incorporate complex or most starches. Okay, and when I say most starches, this is where I talk about potatoes and bananas, okay, because those are actually falling in that root family and fruit family there, where if you, once again, cook the potato well, that's going to help break that down a little bit, and combine the potato with a fat source or a protein source, then it's going to balance out where it's okay. With the banana, if you wait longer till it is more browned or close to browning with the brown spots on it, then it is more simple sugar at that point than it is starch. It breaks down over time with that. So those are important little notes and side notes on the banana and the potato. But most complex or starches like grains, bread, pasta, rice, and corn, we don't want to be consuming those in large amounts on a regular basis. Those are the wrong types of carbohydrates, and we're going to talk about why they affect you here negatively. So in order to understand better which ones and why we want to eat these simple carbohydrates more than we want to get into the complex with the starches, it's important to understand a little bit of history here in itself. So we're going to jump back to the 1970s, and you might be thinking already, but I thought like grains were supposed to be healthy for you, they're recommended by, just kind of put that to the side for right now. So we're going to look at the glycemic index here and how it came about and get a better understanding of it. So the thought process back in the 1970s, and this is, you know, when the glycemic index was about to be formed or came up with, was that the absorption would be slower in more complex carbohydrates because of the fiber content. So everybody was telling everyone to eat whole grains and legumes and to avoid fruit juices because that was the thought process. But there was a flaw to this, and we'll get to that in a second here. So in 1981, David Jenkins came up with the publication of the glycemic index after studying how these different types of carbohydrates actually influenced our blood sugar levels. So he discovered that most starches had a higher glycemic index than even sugar and juices, okay? And here's how this works, okay? So the glycemic index is a ranking of carbs from 0 to 100 and having their effect on the blood sugar, how quickly they digest and absorb into the bloodstream. If it has a high glycemic index, this means that they are rapidly digested and absorbed. If it has a low glycemic index, this causes a gradual rise in blood sugar and in insulin as a result, okay? So that's important to note. The more glucose that something has, okay, the higher the glycemic index rating. Now remember, back to our definition of polysaccharides, those are long chains of glucose. So our complex polysaccharides, long chains of glucose, when those are broken down, have a higher effect on the glycemic index on that scale, causing a quicker rise in blood sugar and a higher spike in insulin in that response, okay? So this spikes our insulin, okay, and results in fat gain, insulin resistance, or obesity, and even diabetes, okay? These spikes are what's causing that, so we need to moderate those spikes, right? Okay? A balanced blood sugar would result in weight loss, energy, and overall health, okay? All starchy foods, keep in mind again, all starchy foods are full of glucose. These are the grains, the rices, the corn, the beans, the legumes, the above ground vegetables that have play a role in that. But this is also where, you know, even though root vegetables like potatoes and bananas are good for you, it might be in moderation that you want to take those in. So simple sugary foods, which are generally composed of glucose and fructose mainly, this is where they have a lower glycemic index actually, because they're a combination of different monosaccharides, not just long chains of glucose. That is important to understand, and that is why when you are eating carbohydrates, we want to focus on those simple mono and disaccharides there. Simple sugary foods that are containing glucose and fructose. Let's talk about fructose a little bit because I know that can have a bad rap as well here. We're going to dive into it real deep. But first of all, fructose is one of the lowest glycemic index numbers. It's like somewhere down at 11 overall. And it has little to no effect on our blood sugar at all. So eating anything in combination with fructose, which is generally the sugar found in fruits, has little effect on our blood sugar. And it actually slows how glucose enters the bloodstream, the combination there. So it's kind of a double positive right there for fructose being low on the glycemic index and slowing the glucose that it's paired with entering the bloodstream overall. But now it's important to understand a little bit of where fructose got its bad rap. So sadly, some people think fructose is as bad as alcohol for our liver. And where they got this idea was from May 2009, Robert Lustig, an endocrinologist, had a talk that was called Sugar the Bitter Truth, which went viral on YouTube. And essentially he was claiming that fructose was causing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and basically playing a role in all these negative health effects in there, to sum it up. The truth about that is that normal fructose consumption in humans has very little to do with weight gain, fatty liver, increased appetite, and even insulin resistance. Basically, we would have to be converting carbohydrates to fat. This is called de novo lipogenesis, DNL, at a very high rate. But in humans, we only convert at about 2%, somewhere around there. So DNL is very low in humans. Now, where did Robert Lustig get this idea of that it might be that severe and that bad in our case? Well, he was studying mice, of course, right? Okay, who have a DNL of around 50%. So it's important to understand that that right there is pretty big and significant, comparing 50% DNL to 2% DNL. And then on top of that, in the study themselves, these mice were ingesting somewhere around 60% of their diet from fructose. Okay, 60% with a DNL of 50%. Of course, these rats are going to be unhealthy and put on a lot of fat and have poor body compositions and health overall. There's no doubt about it. So that right there is a pretty big flaw in this conversion of the idea that it would be affecting us in the same way. To give you an idea of what that might come out to, it would be the equivalent of us drinking about 5 liters of soda a day. That would be what we'd have to do to pretty much take in that 60% of our diet from fructose. And I don't think anybody's doing that. There might be somebody out there that is, but that could be something that is really playing a role in it. But that's important overall. It's this idea that fructose was bad came from really, again, a pretty flawed concept and study, and it feeds into people wanting to avoid things like fruit, which is scary, just to be honest. The thing I've always told my clients before I ever got into any of this, diving deeper and deeper, is that, have you ever seen anybody get fat on fruit? And if you have, please tell me, because I've yet to see somebody that has. So it's really important to understand that fructose is beneficial more than anything. So fructose is actually even more thermogenic than glucose. Again, remember, heat is our friend. We want heat in our bodies. Okay, so it's more thermogenic, and it helps detox our liver from alcohol about 80% faster. Okay, so it can help if you've consumed alcohol to eat fruit the next day, because it'll help us detox from that alcohol quicker. It increases our CO2 production, and remember, CO2 is an antioxidant. We do want more CO2. That is a good byproduct of a higher metabolism, and even energy production. It has little to no effect on the blood sugar and insulin. Remember, there's no need for insulin to help our bodies actually convert fructose into energy in our body. So we don't need insulin to carry fructose into the cells. That's a big role, so it doesn't cause that spike. Okay, it enters the cells without insulin, and it improves overall the retention of other vital nutrients like magnesium, specifically, to name one, as well. So that is some big keys right there on fructose as to why we shouldn't be avoiding fruits and these simple sugars for the sake of fructose. Now, maybe if you're consuming a lot of high fructose corn syrup, where it's something that is processed and modified, that might be problematic, yes. But when it comes from natural sources like milk, in the form of fruits, in the form of honey, any of those, we shouldn't be worrying about it. So it is the blood sugar spikes that promote obesity, weight gain, and all the problems. It's not the carbohydrates in themselves, it's the type of carbohydrates that are being eaten. So anytime we see increased blood sugar, this is always going to increase in an insulin response, which is why we touched on the glycemic index there. Okay, so insulin shuttles sugar into our cells for energy. Okay, most forms of glucose needs insulin to be shuttled into the cells to produce energy. If the cells are full or if they're unable to metabolize, that's another important key. If they're unable to metabolize these, the glucose that's being brought into the cell, then this is when we see that energy get stored as triglycerides or as fat, basically. Most fruits, fruit juices and milk are higher, they have higher levels of vitamins and minerals, first of all, than starchy grains, which is also important to note that a lot of fruits come with potassium. Okay, potassium pushes sugar into the cells without the need of, or in help of, or in aid of insulin, I should say. So this is a way that by eating fruits and those simple sugars, that is also helping push through the nutrients that it contains with it in that package into the cell without the use of insulin overall. So more potassium equals the decreased effect of insulin, which means less blood sugar fluctuations and less fat gain overall. Now, the problem with the grains, or I should say that the other benefit here with fruits, or the problem with the grains, is the anti-nutrients in the grains and the voidness of anti-nutrients in the fruits. So in grains, we see things like phytates and trypsin inhibitors. These are in grain seeds and legumes, I should say. Phytates actually inhibit the absorption of certain minerals, specifically calcium being a big one in one of them. And then trypsin inhibitors are actually protein, block the enzymes that break down protein. So this would be something that actually could create a protein deficiency in someone that even gets enough protein if they're eating too many trypsin inhibitors. So that can play a role as well. And again, these simple sugars and carbohydrates do not contain those. So that's why we want to focus on those. They're also low in polyunsaturated fatty acids. And if you didn't watch my video on those, I'll link that one here so that you guys can watch that as well, because polyunsaturated fats also play a negative role on our metabolic processes overall here. They're easier to digest, our simple carbohydrates and fruits, which means that there's also less bacterial overgrowth and endotoxin in our gut. Now, what happens, remember, cellulose cannot be broken down. Other types of fiber are harder to break down in our bodies. What happens is when that sits in our gut, it feeds the bacteria, good and bad, in there, and that can cause bacterial overgrowth, which can lead to endotoxin, which are toxins in the cell walls of those bacteria. So when those bacteria break down, that releases the toxins into our body as well, which can be problematic overall and cause issues with our gut health. Okay, so there's a lot going on here with simple sugars that promotes the fact that we are overall working on our health and supporting that, versus the, again, lean body, metabolic, lean body only focused goal that most people are going for, or weight loss only goal. We got to get out of that mindset altogether. So really what I recommend with those are pulp OJ, honey, cooked and skinless apples are good options. Peaches can be a good option. Pears, nectarines, watermelon, and papaya. And anytime you cook those things, it helps because you're breaking down some of those fibers already before you eat them, which is a big benefit, again, so that we're not promoting bacterial overgrowth in our bodies. So keep that in mind. Those fruits are all great options. If you can cook the fruit, it's even going to help a little bit more because it makes it easier to digest on our body, which is beneficial also. So to wrap this one up for you guys here, should we be eating carbohydrates or should we be cutting carbohydrates from our diet? Is that really necessary? The answer is yes and no, depending on the type, right? Okay, but we also want to note that the combo matters. We shouldn't be eating even these simple carbohydrates by themselves. We always want to be eating in balance with protein, carbohydrate, and fats all together during a meal. If you're eating them in isolation, this is what causes that blood sugar to spike a little bit more. So when we eat them with proteins and fats, we see slower absorbency and a steadier flow of energy from that type of meal versus a spike and a drop, spike and a drop. And again, remember, it's all about balancing the blood sugar correctly, making sure that we're not getting tons of spikes and dips in there. That's really important, especially when it comes to our body composition overall, or weight gain and weight loss there. So we gotta minimize spikes, we gotta regulate well. Even when we're eating high protein, it's important to know that that in itself is something that can also create spikes without balance. So even if we eat high protein, this too can cause insulin spikes. But what happens is when that dips after the insulin is released, is that we see also adrenaline and cortisol released, which causes our bodies to break down more of our own tissues. Again, remember, that could be muscle, fat, organs, any other those tissues, to create glucose to bring our blood sugar back to a normal level again. So even in the case of protein, that can cause these dips and spikes again. We need to have balance overall. If you haven't been eating carbohydrates and you're interested in adding them back in, the key is adding them back in slowly to start. And even when you do that, you're still likely going to see your body have some pushback at first, because it's been conditioned to eat in a way and metabolize in a way that it hasn't been using those sources of fuel readily. So your body's always going to have an adaptation period when you do add those in, and just know that and just expect that, and it's okay. But what the key is here is that we're going for long-term health rather than a short-term physique and look to it. And that is the overall importance of it here. So if you guys like this video, make sure you let me know by clicking that big thumbs up below. Take a moment to share this one with a friend who's been avoiding carbohydrates. Maybe they need to hear this, or who's been at least questioning if they should be avoiding carbohydrates. Make sure you pass this their way so that they can actually take into account the variables that they really need to be looking at when they're making this decision overall. And last but not least, if you have not already, make sure you take a moment to hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss out on future content like this. Every Thursday, I'm putting out videos showing you how to resolve aches and pains, prevent injuries, and overall optimize your performance inside the gym and outside of it in your daily life and routine. And it does not get much better than that. So take advantage of it. Welcome to the Stronghold Army. I'll catch you guys next week.